Hi everyone, my name is Sally Hatton. I'm the Young Persons Project Officer at Metabolic Support UK, but as we've said, I also live with a rare condition myself. So I'm just here to talk a little bit today about my condition, my experiences growing up with it, and some of the work I do now and what it's like to be a patient living with a condition. So my condition is called XLH, or X-linked hypophosphatemia. It is a rare disorder, it affects around 1 in 20,000 people. And it's a rare inherited metabolic bone disorder, which is a bit of a mouthful, and it's related to a lack of phosphate in the blood. So phosphate is a mineral which is used for bone and muscle development. We take it in from food and drink. The body absorbs it, takes in what it needs, and what it doesn't need, it then diverts to the kidneys to be wasted. So when the body has enough phosphate, it releases a hormone called FGF23, which is responsible for triggering that process of removing phosphate. So it does it in two ways. It stops the absorption of phosphate and it also directs it to the kidneys. So patients with XLH overproduce this hormone, which means that the body wastes phosphate that it needs. It affects all the bones and muscles in the body, so it has quite a wide range of symptoms, and severity can vary quite a lot in patients as well, and there isn't really much of a pattern with how severity presents in families. But there are some symptoms which affect almost all patients, which I can go through now. So the main hallmarks are generalized bone and muscle pain and weakness, which is on a pretty much sort of constant basis, again, with different severity. And bow legs and a difference in gait or the way the patient walks are a real common symptom that will affect every patient to some extent with XLH. It also causes short stature. Very common as well are dental abscesses due to weakness in enamel, and also stress fractures can develop in adulthood and are very common as well. So how is XLH treated? At the moment, the most common treatment has been regular supplements of phosphate. So I myself take a phosphate supplement 4 times a day at regular intervals in a drink. The thing that should be noted as well is it's possible to have a toxically high level of phosphate in the body. So what it means is you can't just sort of throw phosphate at the problem. The way I usually describe it is it's like trying to fill a leaky bucket. So you can't plug the leak. You're trying to keep as much in there as you can, but you also don't want to overflow. So you've got to find the right level, and XLH patients are regularly monitored for their blood phosphate levels. So I have a blood test every 6 months to monitor mine, and then if needs be, we'll adjust my medication. And surgical intervention is also very common in XLH patients to address any bone shape differences or any fractures that might occur as well. So XLH is inherited, but it can also appear spontaneously, which is what happened in my case. So I have no family history of XLH, it's just appeared in me. And there is no known cure, but there is a development of a new treatment called burosumab, and that's been developed to suppress the hormone that causes the underlying issue. So it's being used in children at the moment, and it's going through clinical trials and early access for adult patients. So a little bit on my life with XLH. I'll start with my sort of diagnostic journey. We were quite lucky that I was diagnosed reasonably quickly, but there were still a lot of experiences in my diagnosis that I see now in my work with a lot of rare disease families. So the first of these are symptoms and concerns being dismissed and misunderstood. So very common with XLH, symptoms first present when a child starts walking. Because of the pressure of the body weight on the legs, that's what starts to cause all the problems. So when I started to walk, my parents noticed that something was different. And when they raised this with the health visitor, it was just dismissed straight away, that they were just worried parents, and also that it might be baby's bow, which is something that occurs in a lot of children when they start to walk. So my parents were just kind of told, it's nothing, it's fine, it'll correct itself and just sort of carry on. But they were still concerned, and they decided at a follow-up sort of routine appointment to raise it again. And a nurse did say, no, actually, I think you're right, there is something different. So then I was sent for testing. It was quite a confusing process. No one really knew what they were testing for. There was a lot of blood test measurements, x-rays, things like that. There was some rather insensitive information given to my parents with misdiagnosis. But eventually we were lucky that one paediatrician picked up that I had a thickening of the wrist, which is a common symptom in babies with XLH, and was able to sort of put that together and knew about XLH. So we did finally have some sort of diagnosis. But then came the search for the right information and treatment. So I was started on phosphate, I was also given some orthopaedic boots, which had no effect, and my parents were also instructed to use a brace when I was sleeping to hold my legs together, which I didn't want to do, and my parents didn't want to do, and it was really sort of distressing time trying to go through that treatment. So my parents started to feel after a while that the help that they were getting from the hospital wasn't correct, and they just felt as if they didn't quite know what they were doing, and they were trying their best, but they just weren't getting the treatment right. And they were also told at one point that while they could be treated to stop my symptoms from getting worse, there was nothing that could ever improve them. So it was before the internet, it was before social media, before even mobile phones, and they had nowhere to go and no one to talk to. And we had just a massive stroke of luck. So my mum was out shopping with me in the buggy and bumped into an old acquaintance who had severe bow-leggedness and a difference in her walk. And she said, "Would you mind if I ask you, we've got the baby and we've got this diagnosis, but we don't know what to do." So this lady took a look at me and said, "Yep, it looks like the same condition." She had been misdiagnosed and mistreated, which is why her symptoms persisted. But she had 2 older children who had had the correct diagnosis and were under an expert paediatrician, again, luckily just down the road in Manchester. So she said, "Ask for a referral to this paediatrician and don't take no for an answer." So luckily, my mum is the sort of person who doesn't take no for an answer. So she went back to the hospital and said, "We want to go and see this doctor," to which they said, "Do you know how young he is? We don't think you should go and see him." But my mum persisted, and she got a referral to Zulf McGall at St Mary's, who is fantastic, sat us down, told us what the condition is, how it works, what the treatment would be, how the treatment would work. It would improve my symptoms to hopefully quite a high degree, and how he would then treat me up until my transfer to adult care. So that started then my life living with a rare condition. So during my childhood, my parents and my doctor took a really sort of positive attitude to my condition. I was never made to feel that I was ill. I was never made to feel that I was different. They explained to me my medicine and why I needed to take it, and it just kind of became something that we dealt with, because even though we'd known one person with XLH, unfortunately, we didn't stay in touch and we didn't really know anyone else. So we just kind of got on and did our best. There were some negatives. Unfortunately, during my diagnosis, I had a very traumatic experience with a blood test that left me with a needle phobia. So phobia isn't a word that I'd use lightly, and it was definitely more than a dislike that doctors had even diagnosed and said, "This is severe." So for me, going every 6 months for those blood tests was probably the outstanding thing growing up with a condition. And there was the occasional negative comments from other children, the way I walked, the way I ran, and the way that I looked. Luckily, my parents just kind of kept a lot of that away from me, and both schools that I went to were really good in addressing that. So overall, I adhered to my treatment really well. I had a good relationship with my doctor, and I did see quite a massive improvement in my bone shape as I was growing up. But it did change when I got to my teenage years and to transition. I started to become a lot more self-aware. I was going to college, I was thinking about uni, and I'm now managing my own appointments. And it did become a lot more obvious to me that there was something different, that I was having more aches and pains, that I looked different, and that people did look at me different and sometimes ask really insensitive questions. And I really started to question myself, why it was like that and how I felt about it. And I felt really sort of on my own and isolated. I'd never met anyone with the condition, and I just felt like just one in a million. So really what this led to eventually was a sort of mental health crisis. It felt very overwhelming in my life. I didn't know how to deal with my symptoms, and a lot of it was centred around my physical symptoms and how that felt. But it started to affect how I behaved. I dressed differently. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to do things. I didn't really want to meet new people because of how my condition was making me feel. So eventually I decided to talk to my doctor about it and ask if there was anything that could be done to help, either from a psychological point of view, but really at that point my main concern was my symptoms. So we made quite a big decision to have my first surgery. So I was 17 at the time, and essentially the surgery was to break and reset both of my legs into a sort of different position, and then they would be pinned. So it was drastic. It was a big decision and a big undertaking. But actually for me at the time, it felt like a huge positive, because it felt like something I could do to get a bit more control and to address how I was feeling. And in some ways, I'm quite proud of what me and my family sort of went through in being in a wheelchair and getting back onto crutches and essentially sort of learning to walk again. Unfortunately, over the next 4 years, there were some slight complications with the plates that I had put in, which resulted in 2 further surgeries. I spoke to my doctor and made the decision together that it would just be better overall to remove those plates. But really, having had those experiences, it did make me feel like I had more control over my condition, and it also improved the symptoms, but it also meant because I was having operations, I was talking to friends and family and people around me a lot more about my condition, and I started to just kind of get on better terms with it. And I also started to look back on my experiences and wonder how maybe I could share them, and if there were other patients out there that were feeling the same things as me. But I didn't really know how to begin or what to do about it. And then I had really another stroke of luck. So a letter came through the door one day from an organisation then known as CLIMB, now known as Metabolic Support UK, inviting me to a patient information day for patients with XLH. So it's kind of mixed emotions because it was a great chance to meet other patients and to connect, but at the same time, because I'd never met anyone with this condition and we dealt with it sort of just as best we could in my family, there was a lot of personal and painful memories associated with it, and it was quite intimidating thinking about suddenly being in a room where all we talked about all day was XLH. But I decided to go, and it was amazing. I met other patients for the first time. I saw people that had much more severe symptoms than I did and how well they dealt with them and what they'd been able to achieve, and also people who were older than me and had seen sort of progression of the disease which can occur and how well they dealt with things. I remember just previously to this, I tried to sort of Google XLH and find more information. It was a couple of years before and there hadn't been much out there, but I found one article that described it as insidious. I don't know if anyone knows, Insidious is also the name of a horror film, so it's not what you want to hear. And after that, I hadn't looked anything further into XLH and just decided I need to deal with it as best I could on my own. So to find a community really changed things for me. And I'd also been debating starting an Instagram blog, so at that point I did, and it allowed me to connect with a lot of other patients. And again, it allowed me to get a lot better information, especially about the development of stress fractures, because I didn't know them, but it was about to happen to me. So I had just a very minor accident. I walked into something at home, developed a bit of a pain, had it checked out, and it turned out I had a fracture that needed to be addressed pretty immediately. So it was probably a point where my relationship with my condition changed again, because it was the first time, even though I'd had surgery before, it'd always been elective, and this is the first time that XLH has sort of popped up and interrupted my life in that way. But because of the information that I had and the new relationships that I had with other patients and my blog, it felt much easier to deal with and think, okay, I can do this, I know what's going on. It was a very complex surgery, unfortunately, because of the problems with my bones. There was a lot of complications. It took a lot longer than expected, and the recovery took longer than expected. But again, I had that community around me. And then once I was going through my recovery, I started to think about what else I could do. I was getting involved with XLH UK and volunteering with Metabolic Support UK. And then a job came up to develop services for young patients and the families. Based on my experiences, it just seemed like the perfect chance. So I jumped at it and was very fortunate to get the position. And I also then started to develop my own advocacy work. So I'm becoming a trustee with XLH UK, who are the first organisation specifically for XLH in the UK. And I was also lucky enough to attend the European Patients Forum summer school training for young patient advocates this summer, which was amazing to meet people from all across Europe, all different conditions, and hear their experiences. So just to end a little on my life and my advocacy today, so for all the things I've gone through, I wanted to talk about, as well from the work that I've done with other patients and young people and advocates, what I think are some of the key issues affecting rare disease patients today. And the first of all of these is challenging perceptions. I found through my experiences that society seems to have a very set idea of what a well and an abled person looks like and what an unwell and a disabled person looks like. And when you have an uncommon condition and uncommon symptoms, you sort of fall in the gap between those definitions. So I could be in a room with someone who knows me and they know my history and they know that I'm maybe not well. But there could be someone else in that room that looks at me and thinks I'm totally fine. I don't ever quite fit in either camp, maybe depending on the day and my symptoms on that day. And I think that's something we need to talk about a lot more and maybe try and challenge that. Along with that as well is body positivity. So I think again, when people don't have a common presentation of symptoms, they don't fit people's definition, and then you start to think of people as being a bit weird, a bit different, a bit other, and it's not helpful. And I think something like social media is a real kind of double-edged sword for patients, because there's all the ideas of perfection and attainment, but it also gives us a great platform to share sort of our real experiences and things that people might not have seen before. That's just a picture from my blog of my holidays with a slightly big scar from my last surgery, and I have other scars as well which are visible when I'm on holiday. But really for me it was only because I'd seen other patients going out there and doing it that I thought, yeah, I'm gonna get on the beach, I'm gonna do it. As well as that, I think there are lots of adjustments that patients need, which again are maybe different to people's expectations, and that's the conversation that's really opening and people are really innovating the way that they can support patients. So this is the Sunflower Lanyards scheme. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. So it's available at UK airports and also at some branches of Sainsbury's randomly. And you can get a lanyard for free. You don't have to answer any questions. You get the lanyard, and what it does is indicate to staff that you might have additional needs that may not sort of be visible straight away, or you may not know to ask for. So I found it really useful. I've also started using it when I need it, a please offer me a seat badge. So this one I got from Manchester Council. Again, it was free. I didn't have to answer any obtrusive questions, but it was really good for me because I'd been challenged before on using a priority seat on public transport, and quite rudely. And I actually just moved because I thought, well, I'm not really disabled, I'm not really ill, so I shouldn't really be sat in a priority seat. But actually some days I just do really need that extra seat, and having a badge like this has allowed me to sort of have that confidence, start that conversation, and hopefully raise awareness for other people that might look at me and think, why does she need a seat? It's not always obvious. Mental health, I think, is a huge thing as well, as I've touched on, and I think a lot of us have touched on. So this is a picture that I took from a blog that I follow online for chronic illness, and I think, again, having that conversation is really important. But in terms of how we treat patients, for me, and I hope maybe this has showed a little bit, having a condition is not just about going to hospital and my symptoms. It affects every day. It affects how I feel about myself, how I view myself, the sports and activities I can do. If I'm going out for food, if I'm going to the cinema, I'm thinking about my condition. I'm making new friends. When I've been dating, it constantly just ticks over in your mind about those considerations. And I think when we treat patients, we do need to look at that as a part of their treatment, as how they're feeling as well. I think with rare conditions or difficult conditions, there is a tendency when patients present with sort of mental health symptoms that it's just, well, you have a condition and that's part of your lot, and of course you're going to feel like that because it's rubbish, end of. And we're not maybe looking at how patients are trying to integrate that into their identity. And finally, I think the thing that's made the biggest difference for me, and probably a reason a lot of us are here today, is finding a patient community. So this is the group that I met in Vienna as part of the European Patients Forum, and it was life-changing for me, and meeting XLH patients in particular has been life-changing for me. I probably can't describe the difference that it would have made when I was younger, and I don't know if I actually would have had the surgical intervention if I'd met other people that looked like me, or even the symptoms were more severe than me, because I wouldn't have been as isolated. So I think bringing patients together is so good for patients, but it's also amazing for research and for clinicians to really understand what affects the day-to-day and what it's like to live with those conditions and the interventions that patients really need. So that is me. So there's more information there, Metabolic Support.